I remember the silence more than anything else. Not shouting, not anger. Silence. The kind that slowly changes the feeling inside an entire room. It happened during supper one evening. The table was full, bowls moving quietly from hand to hand, chairs creaking softly against the wooden floor. Everything looked normal, but something underneath the room felt tense. Heavy. I didn't understand why at first. Nobody explained anything directly in our community. People spoke carefully, quietly, especially when something uncomfortable happened. And that night, something uncomfortable had happened. A young woman from a nearby family had refused a marriage proposal. No screaming followed, no dramatic scene. That's what shocked me later when I thought about it. Because the silence itself carried more pressure than yelling ever could. Nobody openly said she had done something wrong, but suddenly, everyone spoke about her differently.
Carefully, softly, like her name itself had become fragile. I remember sitting there pretending to focus on my food, while secretly listening to the adults talk in low voices nearby. And even though nobody directly criticized her, I could feel disappointment sitting quietly underneath every sentence. That's when something started to feel off, not because she refused marriage, because I realized how deeply people expected women to say yes. I didn't understand it then, but expectations become powerful when they exist silently inside everything around you. That realization stayed with me for years, because growing up, marriage never felt presented as a choice emotionally. It felt like a path already waiting for you. A future everyone quietly assumed would happen. People talked about when you married, not if. And because of that, many young women learned something very early. Saying no carried emotional consequences nobody openly discussed. Not punishment exactly. Something quieter than punishment. Distance, whispers, awkwardness, concern hidden inside polite smiles. I remember watching how people treated that young woman afterward. Nobody attacked her openly, but the warmth around her changed. That frightened me more than anger would have. Because emotional pressure often works best when nobody openly admits it exists. At the time, I told myself this was normal, that maybe communities simply feared change. But deep inside, something resisted that explanation, because I could see what silence was doing to people emotionally, especially women, especially young women still trying to understand themselves. Weeks later, I saw her alone outside after church. The parking area was nearly empty. The wind moved dust quietly across the road. She stood beside the fence, staring down at the ground. And when I walked toward her, she smiled politely. But her eyes looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things, weather, family, work. Then suddenly, very softly, she said something I never forgot. I didn't refuse because I hated him. She paused after saying that, like even speaking honestly felt dangerous. Then she whispered, I refused because I didn't feel ready. That sentence stayed with me for years, because suddenly, I realized how little emotional readiness mattered inside conversations about marriage. People talked about responsibility, faith, commitment, but rarely emotional preparedness. And emotional preparedness matters more than people realize, especially when someone is expected to build an entire life beside another person. Looking back now, I think many women feared disappointing others more than they feared unhappy marriages themselves. That realization breaks my heart now. Because fear should never guide life decisions that deeply. But nobody talked honestly about fear either. Fear stayed hidden, like everything else. I didn't understand it then. But silence shapes people long before they recognize it happening. It teaches them which emotions deserve expression, and which emotions should stay buried quietly. That's what happened inside many young women. Questions stayed hidden, doubts stayed hidden, fear stayed hidden, and eventually, many stopped trusting their own emotions completely. That's the dangerous part, not strict expectations alone, the emotional disconnection created by silence. Another woman once admitted something similar to me after her engagement. We were sewing together late one evening while rain hit softly against the windows, and suddenly she stopped working and whispered, I don't even know if I want this. I remember looking at her immediately, because hearing honesty spoken that directly felt rare, almost shocking. Then she looked down quickly and added, but everybody already expects it now. That sentence explains more about emotional pressure than people realize, Because once expectations become public, saying no feels heavier, not because women physically cannot refuse. They can, but emotionally, the pressure surrounding that decision can feel enormous. That's the part outsiders rarely understand fully. The pressure wasn't always loud. Sometimes it lived inside silence, inside disappointment, inside community expectations nobody officially announced. And quiet pressure often changes people more deeply than open force ever could. Night after night, I kept thinking about those conversations, and every morning, I noticed how many women quietly carried emotional uncertainty while pretending confidence. That was the hardest part, the pretending. Because once people believe confusion should stay hidden, they slowly stop recognizing their own emotional needs. That realization changed the way I viewed adulthood completely. Looking back now, I don't think the biggest issue was whether Amish women could refuse marriage. The bigger issue was whether they felt emotionally free enough to truly choose. Those are very different things, because a person can technically have a choice, while still feeling emotionally trapped by expectations surrounding them. That understanding took me years of slowly learning words I didn't have growing up. Pressure, emotional suppression, fear of disappointing others, people-pleasing, shame, things many women experience deeply, without knowing how to describe them. And once you finally have language for your emotions, your entire past begins making sense differently. Not perfectly, but honestly. Looking back now, I think many women weren't afraid of marriage itself. They were afraid of becoming disappointments. That fear changes people quietly, especially inside communities where belonging matters deeply. I still think about that young woman sometimes, the one who said no, because years later, I realized something important. She may have been one of the bravest people I ever knew, not because refusing marriage was rebellious, because listening honestly to your own emotions inside a culture of silence requires enormous courage. And maybe that's the part nobody talks about enough. Not the refusal itself. The emotional strength required to disappoint expectations and still trust yourself afterward. If you're still listening, maybe part of this story feels familiar to you too. Maybe you grew up somewhere expectations felt heavier than your own emotions, where disappointing people felt terrifying, where silence shaped decisions more than honesty did. If you did, you're not weak, and you're not alone. That's something I wish more women heard growing up. Some things stay with you, not as memories, but as emotional habits your body learns long before your mind fully understands them. And maybe speaking honestly about it now is the first step toward finally breaking that silence. If this story connected with you, leave a comment below. Sometimes hearing me too helps people feel human again. And if you want more honest stories people usually stay silent about, subscribe, because maybe these conversations matter more than we realize.